Excellent. Thank you, Jonathan. In your words, the economics at the end of the day are what they are. So let's dig into that further. Your questions are what they are, and we're looking forward to hearing them. They're appropriately numerous, so we'll dive in. We have sufficient time that we can actually take one at a time. So let's attempt that, and then we'll batch as needed. So Anas, will you kick us off?
So Jamie, thank you for chairing the panel. It's an important discussion for us to have today, and I'm really glad that we've been able to sort of get you here as well. Paul, I wanted to just pick up on something that you talked about, which is really sort of at the end of the economic chain here, which is actually the effect of payment structures on the effectiveness of incentives for you to sort of develop new antibiotics. And you touched on this difficulty that DRG payment systems have in that they just encourage a race to the cheapest intervention. Because if I'm on fee for service, I don't mind if you're in 7 or 8 days longer than you could have been. In theory, as we move to a more value-based purchasing paradigm, which will solve everything, that should surely just tip the incentives in favor of a drug that can get my patient recovered from their C. diff in half the time and out of the hospital, saving all of those nights in hospital at an increased cost. Is that happening? And if not, why not?
So I'm not a physician. So I can't speak to sort of how drugs are necessarily being used on an individual basis. But I think what we have seen is that the way that drugs are evaluated for reimbursement, especially in Europe, let's start there, given the way that the clinical trials are done, where you have a non-inferiority trial to a generic comparator, that inherently the evidence that you need to get a reimbursement rate that will make the reimbursement sufficient to create an ongoing economic incentive to be in this space is not there. So that's one issue. The second issue comes to the DRGs so DRG I think is a pretty U.S. based term, but many countries have these bundled payments for hospitals, and so when you have two drugs, one of which may be a broad spectrum but cheap generic drug, and another might be a narrower spectrum but more expensive drug that was developed to really try and target a pathogen. Under the DRG system, the hospital system will be incented to use that cheaper drug, and that's what will be put on first place in the formularies. And if you want to use the more expensive drug, that's a real challenge to that physician that wants to use that drug. So I think we need to look at what are ways that we can make sure that patients are getting access to the drug that is most appropriate to them based on their infection. And one of the issues certainly is the availability of diagnostics. And that's a real challenge. Getting into this, I didn't really understand that there's a geography question in terms of a place for susceptibility tests on these diagnostic tests. And it's not insignificant to get susceptibility testing for a new drug put on one of these automated susceptibility tests. But even with that, we have to find a way that the cost question is not the predominant driver to the choice of the medicine for the patient in the hospital. Because we need to acknowledge that if we're going to have development of novel antibiotics, the system is going to have to pay a higher cost for those than they pay for drugs that were developed 15, 20 years ago. And in the discussions that we've had in multiple payer systems, whether it's in the Nordics or in other places, you'll talk to the public health officials, and we've had multiple instances of this where we'll talk to the public health authorities, and they'll come up with a system, and then you take it to the payer, and the payer will say, well, why would we go with this novel system when if we do it the way that we've got it, we'll pay less? So we have to get to the situation where health systems are comfortable paying more for a novel antibiotic than they would for a cheap generic, which may not be the most appropriate drug for that patient.
Okay, thank you. Jay?
Thank you, and thank you for your presentations. So it seemed, I think every one of you said there's a need for more pull incentives. And a couple of you mentioned that nobody or no governments are writing billion-dollar checks. I don't know, maybe the Gates are, I don't know. But so one type of incentive that was alluded to was transferable market exclusivity. And I'm somewhat familiar with that. Actually, our new forum member, Karen Grosser, to my right, was the head of a team. Is that right? Were you the head of the team, or there was a team reporting to you that was developing bedaquiline, a first new drug in 40 years for tuberculosis with resistant TB. And at Janssen, and I was an executive at Janssen involved in funding decisions, and from the preclinical, although I would say a big driver for that was, to be perfectly honest, altruism. The fact that their FDA offered market exclusivity for a list of neglected diseases was certainly a factor in decisions to support, was highlighted in a factor in decisions to support that program. I heard, Thomas, and so one might look at that as a success, although I heard you say there's some political issues. I know in pediatric research, exclusivity has been both successful but criticized for being perhaps too expensive. But I heard Paul say that, it just takes simple observation to see that there's not enough incentive because it's not happening. So I guess the question is, couldn't one design, what are the public objections or political objections, and couldn't one design a way to compensate through exclusivity that would avoid some of those objections but be sufficient to promote this sort of, so that you could develop a drug and keep it on the shelf in reserve, but have that sort of compensation as an incentive to do that?
Great question, Thomas.
No, I personally believe we really need an honest debate about incentives. We basically in the industry and the Alliance came a long way because initially we were bogged down in trench warfare. The ones said anything else but market entry rewards will not fly. Others said anything but a transferable exclusivity extension will not give us the money we need. And others, we want reimbursement reform. I personally believe, depending on the political system you're in, we may need to experiment with one or the other. I have to admit, being European, I sat for 15 years in our reimbursement advisory committee. I'm deeply apprehensive that we will ever get the recognition we would need in the reimbursement level, because you do have the non-inferiority problem. You do have basically it's incremental progress, and you don't have patients clamoring as you do for cancer or end-of-life treatment. Because the challenge in the DRG environment is the dead patient is much cheaper than the patient you have for weeks in an intensive care unit. And that's the cynic response. The reason why I personally believe and don't hesitate to say one needs to look into the notion of an IP-based incentive is the reality of the political system is that it may be challenging to get something in the order of $20 billion checks signed for, let's say, the 10 new antibiotics we would need just for maybe the next 10 years. The TEE or IP-based system has a politically challenging because people think, oh God, the industry already price gouges, takes us for a ride, and all the elements you alluded to. That said, you don't need somebody signing the $10 billion check up front if you do have an IP-based system, because in many countries you will have a budget framework where those who invest and successfully invest will benefit, and those who don't invest will to some extent pay the price. That would be the case in France, would be the case in the UK with the PPRS, and in quite a number of other countries. Also, I think one of the elements which I notice in our industry discussion is there's a willingness to talk about guardrails, which means to admit honestly we can't have just a free ride. I was in Geneva sitting opposite Jamie Love from KEI, who immediately figured out, oh my God, 6 months exclusivity extension could be $7 billion when you look at how much Lipitor made in the best year. Now, we are realistic, and therefore we are willing to talk about guardrails. You could also link it to stewardship provisions. You could link it to access provisions, because everybody knows that it would be unacceptable that people in the US or Switzerland would have access to these antibiotics, but people in developing countries wouldn't. Therefore, the notion of also possible combination with medicines patent pool or other elements, I think that's open. I would most welcome if somebody, be it Bill Gates or somebody else, would sign the $10 billion checks. The reason I believe in pull incentives is the push incentives work up to a point, as Jonathan said, but you subsidize research, and you also subsidize ineffective research and research which never leads to a product. Pull incentives, you reward those who bring the product successfully to the market. But I believe we in the industry, we need to be open-minded, and we shouldn't exclude one or the other.
I think just to add to that last point that Thomas made is an important one, that we're rewarding companies for success, and we're rewarding and giving revenues at the end of the day that are significant, that you're able to have reasonable confidence that they will become available, and you're not paying for the inefficiencies and the failure of 98% of medicines that start in a drug discovery lab that never make it into an approval. The other thing is that it rewards both big companies and small companies. So as you think about larger companies that are considering investment in antibiotics, they may have some of those products that would benefit from the transfer of exclusivity. There's also small companies that are able to then partner and out-license to larger companies as they think about being able to potentially sell that exclusivity to the larger players. So it doesn't it rewards and it incentivizes investment and research across the board. And I think this is one where there are oftentimes exceptions made, right? Whether it's exceptions for people say that there's some sort of a large revenue that we don't want to, have some sort of a windfall. There's also exceptions made in terms of what therapeutic categories we should be investing in. But I would say this is one where it's important to keep all of us focused on what it is that we actually need to do research on, and not let exceptions, I think, steer us away from the conversation that needs to be had around having that return on the investment that is needed. And transfer of exclusivity is certainly one area that does enable that, and does enable companies to be able to point to that as having a commercial viability as far as the investments.
Okay, very cogent. Thank you. Kimberly. Oh,
Correct.
please,
I think a
please.
factual matter in my statement, I believe what the agency offered was not transferable exclusivity, but transferable priority review voucher. Is that right?
Bedaquiline
Right, with
case.
bedaquiline, right.
That was the bedaquiline case, but to the best of my knowledge, the FDA is lukewarm about having too many PRVs.
Okay, thank you. Kimberly Thompson. First of all, this is a fascinating discussion, and as somebody who does think about investment cases, I think it's actually really important to hear this perspective because often people don't hear the perspective of all the different stakeholders. So I quite appreciate the panel. So I'm going to ask you guys to comment on two things. One is with respect to the fragile environment and the uncertain return on investment, how much of that is because we don't have enough trust in our system across all the stakeholder groups? In other words, if you do create a product that has value that the market should pay for, but what you're hearing is that they won't. Is there a way to create something, a public-private partnership, or something that would allow you to feel like you could trust the partners that they would pay for it? Or is it just an issue that there's no mechanism to get that kind of public-private partnership to work? The example that I'm most familiar with is the Manafravac development by Serum Institute, funded by the Gates Foundation, which was to fill a gap for really trying to develop a vaccine. And the investment case was made, and a manufacturer came in. And of course, as you know, the price of the vaccine is determined in part by its demand or anticipated demand. And I think one of the issues that we're seeing right now as this case is playing out is that, in fact, maybe not all the demand is going to be there, and that's going to have an impact on the manufacturer. So I think one perspective that's missing here is the ability of people to speak honestly about what really the expectations are on all sides, on all stakeholder parts, and what we need to be able to trust each other to, in fact, make sure that the incentives are right and aligned for everybody. That's not happening very well as far as I can see. So I'm going to throw that out there and ask you to comment. I know that may be a sensitive topic for you to each comment on, but maybe you can either nod or say, no, you're wrong, and that would be helpful. I think that the issue also with the pull incentives and getting across the valley of death, there's a real challenge, in terms of figuring out how to get people to understand the full value of the products. And from the kinds of analyses that we might do as economists, we can certainly see the value that's there. There's plenty of return on investment in the system. So the question is, how does that get divvied up, really? And I think part of the challenge is that we don't necessarily see that if we don't figure out how to create the right incentives for all the stakeholders, that things won't happen. So part of what I'm hearing from you is that the market right now is not favorable because some of those incentives are really misaligned. And I guess I'd love to hear more specifically about what kinds of conversations need to happen in which forums to try to figure out how to fix that issue. And then finally, I think there really are big differences between willingness to pay for innovation as well as for the actual products themselves across different markets. The US has historically been a very favorable place for innovation, and that's been pretty important for the pharmaceutical and other industries. And I guess one other question I have for you is whether or not you think there's a change happening in that somehow maybe Americans are less willing to be paying for more of the innovation that's supporting a lot of the global development, or conversely, if you are seeing that, in fact, other countries are stepping up in an increased way, and whether that's going to change this conversation as well. Thank you.
So Kimberly, first I want to thank you. I'm really reveling in all of your inquiries, in part because it demonstrates, I think, the power of a National Academies meeting. I've been in many conversations around R&D, AMR, and never have I heard someone ask a question that so powerfully distills those fundamental issues at play and brings them to the surface, just beautifully articulated. So those are obviously hefty questions and multidimensional in their very natures. Anyone courageous enough to take on any part of them? Thomas, please.
One element, I think, coming from Geneva, public-private partnerships, all for it. Actually, when you look at the Innovative Medicines Initiative in Europe, the equivalent to NIH here, the initiative, the coalition for bad, new antibiotics for bad bugs, that is public-private partnership. The bedaquiline example, which Jay mentioned, that's public-private partnership. The difference between new vaccine against one disease, we need many new antibiotics and vaccines, and the bacteria will be resistant again, and therefore just one will not be enough. But I think we need to build trust. I see when I talk to GARD-P, which is the NDI, WHO related, they're very positive about the willingness of companies to enter into partnerships with them. But they're equally realistic that's not sufficient. I'm very supportive of what the Wellcome does. Very supportive of the German R&D hub. The UK has invested quite a bit in this field, but I think everybody knows that's by far not enough. That's why we need to talk about new pull incentives. And in terms of assessing, I think one of the elements, I don't expect that we will get, fabulous return on marginal added value. I was a member of the European Commission's high-level working group on high-level forum on pharmaceuticals, and one of the elements we did was how can you assess the relative effectiveness of new drugs, and I could easily see combination, and by the way, WHO has done some groundwork in terms of priority pathogens. You could link it up to there. Therefore, there are many answers, and we would need a day to talk about them, but I think we are willing to engage.
I think one key aspect of trust is I think we need to look for solutions to the market challenges that we have that balances the risk that we're asking the public sector to bear and the risk we're asking the private sector to bear. And so that's why I think it's important to look at this suite of incentives that allows us or helps us to do that. So if we have the public sector and the private sector investing in early stage development through BARDA grants that they pay part, the private sector pays part, or through R&D tax credits where you get it we've seen with orphan drugs, for instance, where you get 50% credit on what you've invested or something like that within the early stage. And then when we look at reimbursement, we look and see, okay, is there a way to make the ongoing return that you would have once the product is brought to market is more commensurate with the value that it's bringing. And I think that's that ongoing revenue from being on market is important because I think we want to see, can we harness the market-based mechanisms that have been useful in other therapeutic areas to determine which products are actually the most important to the actual in use. Because when a product initially comes through approval, it's not necessarily clear which of the products that come to approval is really going to be the most helpful and the most useful over time. So that's why one of the, I think, key aspects of really valuing these products appropriately is making sure that they are adequately reimbursed in the market. But then we have the fundamental issue of antibiotics where we want to not necessarily have to use them. And so early in the product life cycle, when it's not clear where this product should be used, it's not clear what the resistance profile in the environment is going to be or how the product is actually going to fit there. The diagnostics aren't necessarily in place. We know that with antibiotics, the time to actually really that product coming into its own as to what it's going to look like in the market takes much longer than in most therapeutic areas. So are there specific things that we could do that creates a return on investment early in the product life cycle that you have some assurance that if you bring a product to market that meets a predetermined public health need, that you're actually going to get that payment, whether it's a market entry reward or transferable exclusivity. I think if we can come to that level of trust that U.S. government or the EU or the Japanese government puts in place a mechanism that says in 10 years, if you're able to successfully bring a product to market that targets this resistant pathogen, there will be an incentive there for you. I think that's the kind of trust we need to have.
I think the other thing that I would want to bring in is the portfolio perspective. So as we think about the investments that we make and as we think about the disease areas that we go after, I know we're talking about antibiotics and anti-infectives in this setting. However, if we have a decision to be made of do we pursue an oncology indication where there's no treatment alternatives? Do we pursue a rare disease where there is nothing for patients, except for hope? And when we think about antibiotics, where there are a lot of uncertainties and questions about, will this product be used? Will it become a standby drug? Is there that willingness to pay? I think there are more question marks as far as what is that return in this specific area. The medical need is there. The patient need is there. It's that commercial landscape that for us, the economics a lot of the times point in a different direction.
Great. So a lot to think about in the response to your very thoughtful questions. Thank you, Kimberly, again. Anna?
Yeah, I just have a couple of very specific questions. It's not really my area, but it's related to the bedaquiline experience in TB. And I wonder if you could say something about the specific experience of BRICS and whether push-pull mechanisms or pull mechanisms work there, because I can see that the countries are falling out of global fund eligibility, but they don't yet have the systems and the money to actually sort of invest in these new drugs, and you've got no market in the high-income countries. So I can see these sort of TB drugs specifically falling in this gap between reliable donor payments, reliable high-income payments, but mid countries which are sort of learning to get uptake. And I think that's been the experience of bedaquiline in South Africa, where potentially they wanted to buy it, but in the end the uptake hasn't been what anyone imagined or wanted. And the other thing I would be interested in hearing more about is how you're dealing with all the different technologies that are coming up, the vaccines and the diagnostics and the drugs, and that relates to the question that you were saying, that these other technologies, such as vaccines, fundamentally affect your market sizes. So I want to understand how you're dealing with that when you're looking at pull mechanisms and how you're anticipating that, say, we might have a TB vaccine and then all the development for the next 15 years in terms of treatment, your market size may be quite different. So I'm not an expert on this, but I'm just curious.
Well, for a non-expert, those were some very excellent questions. And I think the vaccines and diagnostic piece certainly goes to the points that Joanna was making around portfolio analysis and decisions and the complexities that come into that. It's not only the therapeutic area, but the types of technologies to be pursued and invested in. And I'll pass it certainly over to Joanna and others here to help to answer that final question. We do have the good fortune, of course, in the National Academies Forum here to have an expert on global fund eligibility, but not just one. In fact, Paul has a long and storied history with the Global Fund and really shaping many key decisions in his board role. So, Paul, maybe you'll take the BRICS question.
So I guess I'll comment first.
Yes,
do you want to comment on? So in terms of vaccines, it's an area that is absolutely one that we're committed to. As Pfizer, we have a whole division that's dedicated to vaccines and to finding bacterial vaccines that introduce, prevention. And so for us, it's part of a larger whole. There is the economics around vaccines are more certain in terms of what are those opportunities. It's still new ground for us as we consider what are the bacterial strains that we're targeting, but it is one that is, I would say it's not an either or as far as, should we be in vaccines or should we be in antibiotics, but it is an area that we're committed to at least.
So I'll try to address the question on TB and on the Global Fund, and then Peter, I'll turn it to you. One of the things I think that it's an interesting distinction between TB and antibiotics is antibiotics sort of writ large versus TB specific, is the question of resistance and antibiotics is really a global question that faces both the developed countries and the developing countries. So some of the challenges that we face in incenting development of drugs for diseases that do not have as much of a relevance in the developed world, we don't face. And I think, in fact, I think TB is a really interesting model about the limits of push funding in terms of bringing products to market, because there's been a lot of push funding in the TB space, and still we see very few products coming to market. And I think that's where we don't want to be for antibiotics writ large. And I think, one thing that would be interesting to see is that given the economic development of the BRICS countries themselves, are there mechanisms that could be put in place that could actually harness the buying power of those countries to stimulate development of drugs that are more relevant for them than they would necessarily be for the developed world? I don't think we've seen that yet, but I think that if China and Russia and South Africa and India got together and said, we want to put in place mechanism to stimulate the development of novel TB drugs, and we would give some kind of advanced market commitment to that, that could be a very interesting model. In terms of the Global Fund and eligibility, eligibility is always a large question for the board, but we're fundamentally driven by two tenets. One is that we want to invest the money that governments and others give to the fund in countries that have highest disease burden and really the lowest ability to finance their own response to the health issue. And so for the most part, the BRICS countries are not eligible for funding outside of India and South Africa.
Peter, any comments?
Sorry, I knew that. I was just wondering the BRICS question answered really is these countries that are falling between the gaps.
And the keen observer can see that we have quite a few interesting and very specific solutions bubbling up as part of this conversation. So thank you, Paul. Great answer. Anything?
Paul answered the question on BRICS, I think, quite effectively.
And in fact, I would agree. So moving in efficient clockwise fashion, we've had Mark and Ramanan being very patient there. So we'll, in the interest of, it seems like in the interest of some sort of grand finale, it may be, before we open it up to the public and questions from our margins of the room. Mark and Ramanan, will you offer us your inquiries?
Great, thanks. Thomas, you're quite right when you say one of the big issues for pull incentives is that nobody's getting the checkbook out to write the check. And I can anticipate all sorts of problems when we do get to the point of actually asking countries to pay. On the other hand, at the moment, we haven't actually asked them to pay because we don't actually have a credible plan. We haven't got you've mentioned the 20 billion that Jim O'Neill came up with. To some extent, that was a number plucked from the air. I mean, it wasn't necessarily a deeply thought through plan, was it? There's different ways you can, yeah. But I mean, is there actually a clear consensus from you about what you actually need, you as the business, what you actually need as a pull incentive in order to bring something to market, to overcome these failures in the way that we pay? Does it, for example, need to be different for a broad-based antibiotic compared to a narrow-based? Is it something to do with first-in-class versus non-first-in-class? Those sorts of issues. Rather than just talking generally, nobody's paid the check, how big should the check actually be in order to overcome these problems? And related to that, the other problem that I think has been very strong internationally, that you've alluded to, but I'm going to make you talk about it again, is the deep suspicion of many countries, not just developing and emerging countries, but also some developed countries as well, that if there's a market entry reward or transferable patent rights, IP rights or whatever, they'll pay twice. They'll not only pay the market entry reward, but then they'll also, if you keep IP still in the current model, they'll also be asked to pay existing high prices for any new antibiotic that comes to the market. So there'll be this sort of double jeopardy. How far are you prepared to go in order to say that, no, you'll make sure that in return for something like a market entry reward, you will provide access at a much lower price or widely available? How far will you go in modifying your IP rights?
So we'll pause there. And that was self-batched, if I can use that term. An incredible question, thrilling. In fact, we talked about billion-dollar checks, numbers plucked from the air, and deep suspicions. So on that dramatic note, I'd love for Jonathan to weigh in, as well as Thomas.
There's a lot there. We've looked at this in different ways in terms of what it would take to answer at least part of your question, Mark. And it really depends on what type of model we're trying to engineer. So are we talking about a fund structure where we're going to identify, meaning some consortium that can address it from a scientific and a stewardship perspective, what the most pressing needs are in terms of pathogens, and start to solve for those and over what period of time, because that's going to evolve over time. So if we're looking at that type of model, then it's going to drive a different set of numbers. So it's tough to put a number on it, certainly, but I do think that there is a lot of intrinsic value in approaching it from the portfolio perspective and thinking about there's a lot of needs out there from a pathogen perspective. What are those most pressing needs from a global perspective, and where do we need to direct initial funding to and some of these initial awards to? In the interest of time, let me pause there, and Thomas, if you want to come in, or others on Mark's question.
I think Mark asked such an easy question, and therefore, as I'm used to, I will fudge it to some extent. And I believe it would be wrong to give you one answer, one number, because I don't expect that we will have a global solution and a global approach. That would take 20 years to come. And when I look into the ISCG, of which you are a member, the Interagency Coordination Group, and the Trilateral, I must say I would need a Prozac to overcome my depression. And I see you nodding. That's too bad. Having said that, when I talk to our peers in the industry, I see a real recognition of the societal expectation and the public health needs. And you see it summed up in the AMR Industry Alliance report. And when I talk to Sally Davis, for instance, or others, they recognize the industry has pulled its act together and is acting responsibly. Ramanan, for instance, is one member of our advisory group where we talk about environmental challenges. Having said that, the challenge right now is there is no market. And therefore, companies who continue to invest, thanks Pfizer, thanks MSD, they sort of bet it on the hope that there may be one. Over the last few months, I saw Sanofi announcing that basically the research is transferred to Evotec. Although they say if something comes out, we have a right to take it back, but would they take it back if there's no market? Same with AstraZeneca, same with Allergan, same with medicines company. Therefore, half of the respondents in our survey on the research said, unless this changes over the next couple of years, they're much more likely to reduce the investment than to beef it up. And I think there is a need and call for action. The reason why I personally refuse to get drawn into the numbers is some companies are very strictly portfolio focused. And in that context, if you come with a valuable treatment against dementia, no cure yet, but valuable, you hit a gold mine. If you make progress in immuno-oncology, look at Keytruda, you hit a gold mine. And if you basically have to overcome that kind of challenge in your portfolio decision, I doubt that anybody would invest in the next 10 years into a new antibiotic. Having said that, I know from the discussions which we are having among industry that what people ask for is at least a return of investment. Because the notion which I hear from Jim O'Neill, for God's sake, Genentech, Roche should invest into antibiotics because they have nobody to sell their immuno-oncology products if people die from ordinary infections. That's a little bit far-fetched because every economist will tell you that's not the way companies make investment decisions. And therefore, I personally believe that this open-mindedness, which you heard from Paul, from Joanna, from me, could be a reimbursement reform, could be market entry rewards, could be something based on IP. By the way, in the IP system, you could link it also into the NTD area, which I think would be quite interesting. The neglected tropical disease, where we also need research. I think that's actually big progress, but we need support from intellectuals like the OECD as a think tank to really make progress.
So when we take a look at industry figures and we simply run the economics on them, the ENPV is negative for us to invest in antibiotics. And the expected internal rate of return is 1/8 of our weighted average cost of capital. So on some level, you'd have to go in and you'd have to say, you'd have to have any type of, whether it's a market entry reward or a transfer of exclusivity, that's in line with making the economics at least be neutral for that investment, knowing that whatever payment that is or whatever pull incentive comes in year 16, year 17 of making that investment up front of all those many years. And so when you think whatever that amount is 17 years from now, discounted back to today to warrant investment, it's at some point, it's basic economics to just make it be neutral for us to be able to make a case to our shareholders, to make a case to our colleagues, to make a case to have that investment internally in this space.
And in terms of making that case, go ahead, Jonathan.
I was just going to add, so we're picking up on part of your question and talking a bit about if you've got a market entry award, a prize incentive, some other type of structure where there's a big amount of money that flows out, right, with the advent of an innovative product that's addressing one of these high threat pathogens. So there are other ways that a Pfizer, a Merck, and so on can improve the ROI and the NPV besides getting $1 billion payday after innovating, hypothetically, after innovating a new product. So the FDA put news out, which I'm guessing most of you saw today, in terms of a renewed focus on AMR, which I think is good news holistically. We'll see what the details manifest to be. But I think two interesting components. One was, the idea of a licensing structure with institutions, at least in the U.S. Again, coming back to what some of the handcuffs are around reimbursement and access, unfettered access in the U.S. market, a licensing structure which could release some of that, if you will. But importantly, and I think the main thrust of my point was the LPAD pathway and having some type of accelerated or reduced burden development pathway, which would greatly change the NPV on any portfolio product that's getting evaluated in the antibiotic space. So again, I think we're going to need a lot. We've talked definitely in this panel about pull incentives and the value of those and maybe different types of models that can apply to companies that are different stages and have different portfolio mixes. But some of these other ideas that were put forth by the FDA and also restructuring or evolving some of the push incentives could be really valuable as well. And hopefully in combination, start to drive those NPVs to an area where you're in a more rational decision-making mode to say yes on a new antibiotic program.
So, Mark, I'll just compliment the special charge that you've given this panel to clarify, crystallize, better articulate, and repeatedly re-articulate what will it take. And I think you began to hear some very strong answers in that regard. And hopefully we'll be as strong in our answers to the grand finale question, which will come from Ramanan. Thank you for your patience.
Thanks for the pressure. So, if I had to sort of, this has been a really good discussion, and I think, certainly everyone's sympathetic to the challenge that industry faces here. And it's a current model, and if AMR had been like completely new and had dropped out of the sky, we might have innovated for it in terms of market entry rewards and so forth. But it's a continuation of how this has happened for many, many years, and therefore there's not the urgency to come out and say, I will today change something in the way that I didn't do 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and that continuity is part of the problem here. The other part is, of course, the reimbursement. I understand what you're saying, Thomas, but I think it's also, in the absence of a price signal that is signaling to users, including physicians, that your newer antibiotic is going to be more expensive, there's a lost signal in terms of conservation. You're not conserving the antibiotics that you have as effectively as if you thought the next antibiotic can also be $2 a dose, and then, you don't really conserve at all. So the challenge is how to not impede access, but also send a strong signal that is promoting conservation. I mean, it's like saying, I'll have $2 gasoline forever, and what does that do for conservation? It really does nothing at all. But the point that I really wanted to get to is there's a further challenge, which, I know we've had many committees, projects, Drive AB, this, that, and the other on sort of all getting this together, but there's still some gaps in this whole idea. For instance, the idea that we can, if we had a brand new antibiotic today and it was sitting right in front of us, that we could actually go out and use that to solve a majority of the million people, or roughly that 700,000 people who died today with, from AMR, is not plausible. We don't really know how to get it from here exactly into that, because there's probably something like 7 billion bacterial infections every year, of which 1 million people die. That's 1 in 7,000. So it's literally like finding that person with a multi-drug resistant pathogen who's going to die is literally, like finding a needle in a haystack. It's not like dealing with orphan diseases, or we're dealing with cancer, where that person has cancer, they're going to be around for at least 6 months to a year, and you have time to go after them and then try to treat them. So there's some fundamental challenges here which mean that getting that new antibiotic alone is not going to solve the problem. There's also going to be this issue of how you get it from here into precisely that person that you want in a way that is the most efficient. And here, I think these are the places where it may be a bit unspoken, but we need to have probably more direction from industry and thought process and owning the problem and how these are really going to happen. If there is a market entry reward, I'm assuming that, the 80% of money that pharma spends on marketing drugs can now be efficiently channeled into doing things of this nature, which is, in identifying people who would die of a multi-drug resistant infection. I think with Cubis, we had an interesting example where they didn't go out and actively market the drug. They waited for people who failed everything else, and then they had the drug that was waiting that could deal with, with that multi-drug resistant infection. So what are your thoughts on how you solve this particular problem, which is, again, very different from all other diseases, where it's identifiable, it's got a face, and then you've got some time, and then you go after it. Whereas here, getting a new drug is not going to solve it unless you can actually get it in the mouth or into the bloodstream of that person who really needs it.
So I will simply amend the question by saying, what are your abbreviated thoughts, given our time? Thomas, would you like to close us out?
Indeed, because actually one of the commonalities of the AMR Industry Alliance is the cross-sectoral collaboration, that we do have diagnostics, generics, biotech, and big pharma companies. One of the challenges, and there I'm glad that bedaquiline was mentioned, of course, is the most mind-boggling proposal from some activists over the last few months would be to address the TB problem by giving compulsory licenses. as was debated before the TB summit in India. That would be the end of stewardship, appropriate use, and you name it. Now, in the TB area, because the bedaquiline is done through the GDF, certified hospitals only, therefore you have some assurance that it's well used. The challenge is that kind of model will not work the same in the antibiotics area. But what I do see is we have a number of companies, GSK, Pfizer, Novartis, experimenting with different remuneration systems for their sales reps, rewarding them for appropriate education, for promoting appropriate use rather than for maximum sales. I think that's crucially important. One of the most challenging issues which we tackle in the Alliance is the environmental discharge. When we heard about China and India, most of the actually active ingredients come from China and India. And oh my God, look at the discharge area. Therefore, I personally believe that we talked about the One Health approach. I do believe in transparency, and as a consumer, I prefer to buy from my food from areas where I know there wasn't an overuse of antibiotics. Actually, I said I stopped eating chickens years ago, even in Switzerland, because I don't trust the chicken farmers. Of course, I've been told that the danger here in the US is much bigger when you eat lettuce, in particular from Arizona, in terms of getting serious infections. But I think we need to address some of these issues because we have to go beyond the human use. We have to tackle some of them. And I think us in the industry starting to talk about it is not the worst thing.
So with open minds, I think that we have opened a conversation that we hope will run for many months and years into the future. Thank you again to the organizers of this great event for allowing us to host this panel and to have this conversation. We have officially run out the clock on our session, which I think is the most appropriate analogy with which to end the day. And with that, I will pass it over to Peter.
Okay, thank you very much.